Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and this is the Keto Made Simple podcast. Before we dive into today's video, I'd like to invite you to join my course, End Your Cholesterol Confusion, a self-paced online program to help you understand cholesterol and reduce your cardiovascular risk with confidence. We'll of course include discussion of the recent lean mass hyperresponder study, the movie The Cholesterol Code, and what it means for you. You'll also get a live Zoom session with me on April 26th. Enrollment runs April 20 to 22, so act now and click the link below. I hope to see you in the course. Hi everyone, Dr. Eric Westman here, and welcome to my channel where I review and debunk nutritional misinformation online, typically. And from time to time, I will interview the movers and shakers in the keto, carnivore, low-carb, fasting, nutrition world. And it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Jason Fung today.
Hey, Eric, good to see you again.
Great to see you. Now, for the few people who've lived under a rock and don't know who you are, please introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm a physician. I'm a nephrologist, a kidney specialist, and I've been really interested in the world of weight loss for about 10 years now because we've seen, of course, this absolute sort of epidemic of obesity, which led to this huge spike in type 2 diabetes, which caused a lot of kidney disease. And a few years ago, I started to get very interested in how to get people to lose weight. So realized that much of what I'd been taught, which is this whole calories in, calories out sort of stuff, was actually just all garbage. It didn't help anybody. That was my clinical experience. If you tell people that, it's not helpful in any way. And people just didn't lose weight, so they weren't getting better. So as I started to think about the science of it all, it was clear that that was really just not like the whole counting calories and calorie as calorie sort of stuff was really just all pure hogwash actually. So that's where I got very interested in sort of low carbohydrate diets, keto diets, and fasting, and that was sort of 2016. Intermittent fasting was one of the things that I sort of started to use in my patients back then. Just saw incredible results, right? And again, the thinking at the time was that it was very, very harmful. But when you actually look at the medical literature, there's no actual evidence that it was harmful. Like, yeah, if you apply it to the wrong patients in the wrong settings, sure, it can be harmful. But that's true of anything, right? On the other hand, if you apply it in the right setting with skill, then it can be very powerful, reversing diabetes, getting people to lose weight. So it was sort of work hand in hand with sort of low carbohydrate diets because they did sort of the same thing, right? About lowering insulin levels and sort of getting the body to help burn its own fat. So that's how I sort of got started in this space, probably about 12 years ago now.
Yeah, so as I recall, you were kind of frustrated as a nephrologist, you went through internal medicine like me, and I always like other internists to get into this space. And but then you kind of realized that doing dialysis, helping with hemo or peritoneal, was not what you signed up for, right?
Yeah, yeah. The key was that, in medical school and so on, what you learn very quickly is sort of how to treat, kidney disease and diabetes and so on. What you don't learn a lot about is sort of what drove it in the first place, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's like you have to go upstream if you really want to help people. So you go from diabetic kidney disease, right? End stage kidney disease, dialysis due to diabetes, right? And then you go, hey, the key there is not treating the kidney disease. The key is to get rid of the diabetes because the diabetes is what's causing kidney disease. Then you go to the diabetes and say, hey, the key is to get people to really lose the weight, right? Because when they lose weight, they really do a lot better. So then you go from, doing dialysis to trying to get rid of their diabetes to get them to lose weight. And that's where, you have to change the diet. And of course, we didn't learn anything about diets and so on. All we learned about, truthfully, was calories in, calories out. It was sort of just left at that, truthfully, in medical school. It's like, it's all calories. And if you eat calories, it's willpower, right? It's like,
Congratulations on your new book, and we'll get to this in greater detail in a moment, but I don't know how you unearthed this information on page 24 of the hunger code. Started with the obesity code, massively popular. Well, I think you started on the YouTube, right, with the explanations and just
Yeah.
I thank you so much for all that you've done in this space, and then the cancer code, the diabetes code, now the hunger code. Anyway, back to I never heard the story about one of my teachers and all of our teachers, George Bray, Dr. Bray, and that he turns out, he was a he wasn't really an obese, genotype, right? So that
Yeah,
he
yeah.
he tried his own so much of this is the researcher tries it, so it must be true, right? Or
Yeah,
the
yeah.
if you have someone in charge of all of obesity research, and he never had the problem, and I've been criticized for this myself, that I wasn't huge to start with, like some of my other doctor friends in this area, but Dr. Bray was someone who, I looked up to, George Bray, head of the Obesity Society, the first author and editor of textbooks for years, and the textbooks got ever bigger, and yet there was nothing about low carb diets, nothing about. It was all calories in, calories out. He would get up and say, "We know what causes obesity. It's more calories in than calories out." And it's because this is the first time I read it in your book that he burned off his extra calories as heat.
Yeah.
So that
It's
he
interesting, eh? Because, he's a legend. So, George Brett is a
well,
legend.
I'll look up to him.
Yeah, absolutely, and, because he was really a pioneer sort of in the field, like, before the field even seriously existed, right? Dr. Bray was one of the pioneers. That's why I thought it was so interesting that was an article he had published, about his own experience, about overeating and all this sort of stuff, which clearly points to the fact that your body doesn't just sort of count calories and stuff the extra into fat because he tried
No.
that himself, right? What happens, and this is what's interesting to me is that if you think about homeostasis, so homeostasis is this sort of fancy word for balance, but it actually is a sort of core biological principle, and it's not just true for body fatness, but it's true for everything, right? So body temperature, if you're hot, you're gonna sweat. If you're cold, you're gonna shiver, right? If you drink a lot of water, you're gonna pee it out, right? If you don't drink a lot of water, you're not gonna pee it out, right? If your sodium is too high, you're gonna drink more water. Like, your body always has to maintain a steady state, right? And body fat's the same. So in other words, if your body gets too fat, then it's gonna try to burn off that extra fat, or it's going to make you not want to eat, right? And that's exactly what he showed, right? He
Well,
did
but
it
but
himself.
but 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 I don't think this is the only phenotype, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I think
yeah, yeah.
well, we're seeing it in a, young physician, PhD, MD from Harvard, Nick Norwitz. He did his own N of 1 trial, and his metabolism was like Dr. Bray's. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Nick was smart enough to just measure his body temperature. And I look back to the really expensive chamber studies, and nobody measured the human's body temperature in all of those kind of
There are old studies that did that, right? So
it
interesting.
kinda got lost, well, I wanted to interject that, Dr. Bray doesn't have the typical metabolism that someone who does gain 500 pounds and ends up in my office has, right?
Yeah,
Then homeostasis is out of whack, right? So
exactly.
if you're saying, "Oh, the body will just start burning its own fat," well, how does it get out of whack then?
Yeah, that's the whole question, right? And it's really about the hormones, right? And insulin is one of the sort of key hormones that puts you out of whack and tells your body, hey, you should be storing more fat or less fat, right? So if your insulin levels are really, really high, then it's basically telling your body you need to store more fat. So if you have a certain level of sort of body fatness, right? I call it the body fat thermostat. If your thermostat's set sort of low, then you're going to be lean. If you go above that, then your body's going to try and burn it off. And I remember reading studies in the that are from the 80s actually that showed that when you sort of overfeed these people, their body heat went up significantly. And then as they lost, and the opposite is true too, right? If your body wants to be fat and you're trying to lose the weight, your body temperature would go down because your body's trying to conserve that energy to maintain that weight. And knowing that's really important because it's not just about counting calories anymore, right? It's not about accounting, right? It's about what is what is affecting this sort of set point that your body wants to have. And it's clearly like the hormones, right? And that's what I think is really interesting in trying to shift the way people think about it. Because and again, I remember reading studies that were from the 80s. Like, if you have a person who's 180 pounds, right, and who's always been 180 pounds, like they'll have a certain metabolic rate. But somebody who was like 200 pounds and lost their weight down to 180 pounds, they're actually burning far fewer calories, right? So their body's trying to get back up to the 200 pounds, which is really important because it's like, how do I get my body to set myself at that ideal weight, right? And that's where sort of the understanding of the hormones and stuff, which is covered in the hunger code. I sort of started in the obesity code talking about insulin, cortisol, sort of expanded it in the hunger code to this sort of the whole sort of gamut of hormones that controls this body fat thermostat, because it does include like GLP-1s, GIP, glucagon, testosterone, estrogen, there's so many, leptin, ghrelin, there's like 10 or 12 of these hormones, thyroid hormone. Not all of them are related to food, but clearly there are a lot of influences on weight other than these sort of calories in, calories out, right? This whole calories thing is to me, it's such an incredibly simplistic, reductionist view. It's completely incorrect and useless from a practical standpoint, yet it gets pushed on us, like pushed on us as doctors, as the only scientific way to look at things. But it's actually not true at all, right? Even if you look at the energy balance equation, they say body fat, which is a store of calories, equals calories in minus calories out, right? So that's true. That's always true. But it doesn't mean what people think it means, because if you simply rearrange the equation and say calories equals body fat plus calories out, right? So that means that for every calorie you eat, your body could either store it as body fat or it could burn it. But which one does it do? Because that's obviously hugely important. Because if you store it as body fat, you're going to get fat. If you burn it, you're not going to get fat, but you're going to feel great. You're going to have lots of energy. You're going to generate lots of body heat. You're going to be warm instead of cold. You're going to have energy. You're not going to have brain fog, right? But that doesn't depend on the number of calories. It depends on what your body does with those calories, right? And that's where the hormones are so important.
100%, except for the let's switch gears. I like to pick your brain about a really difficult case. So and I know, I'm so happy to talk to another internist about this, and then also someone who's been in clinical practice about this. I think that differentiates us from a lot of other influencers. But this person had weight loss surgery, 20 years ago, had lost 150 pounds and was struggling with maintaining weight loss. Well, it actually had another 50 pounds to lose. And, in the 60s ish, you got the perimenopausal and postmenopausal stuff. You got not only hormones, you got drugs now, excuse me, for the selects other brain, emotional, or mental health medications, and her body temperature is 96 Fahrenheit. So it's low. And the thyroid levels are normal. And basically, it's someone who, if we do use the calorie, and this is where I do actually talk calories in the clinic, where if the only tool he or she wants me to use is changing the diet, energy, and protein substrate, I needed to get the calories down really low intake. And so I'll actually introduce calories in some situations as a commonality of, you can, but have you watched the show Naked and Afraid, or Survivor, or Alone, where people go out and they eat nothing? They will lose weight. I mean, this is also post bariatric surgery, post GLP-1s or other weight loss medicines. The reasons they work include lowering the energy intake. So I'm at the extreme case, actually, I reintroduce the concept that we need to get the energy down if we're not going to use any other sort of technique, like using a medication or even thyroid. So how would you approach someone who, and then I'm much more open to intermittent fasting, even total fasting in these cases. How do you view kind of the extreme worst case scenario? And I imagine I'm talking to this patient right now. And
Yeah, I mean, for sure, calories is one aspect, right? Because that is the number of the amount of energy, right? So, but it's not the only aspect. So certainly in certain cases, so I also I'm a proponent of fasting where calories goes very, very low. But that's not the primary point, right? To me, the primary point of fasting is really to adjust those hormones. So there's certain hormones that get adjusted down, right? So insulin goes down, right? But also things like mTOR might go down, which may have other effects. But then things go up too. So you have sympathetic tone, which goes up, growth hormone goes up, but cortisol also goes up, right? Ghrelin tends to go down. So you're changing a lot of these hormones that affect weight. But by doing fasting, and sometimes we'll do sort of extended fasting, so sometimes longer. And the point to me is not to say, okay, well, I'm eating fewer calories. The point is that when you're getting your insulin levels down low enough, then you're allowing your body to release the stores of body fat. Because if you have, say, 50 pounds of body fat that you want to lose, that's 375,000 calories that are just sitting there. So the question is, why is your body not using them? Because if her body is actually burning fewer calories, it's sort of limiting its calories, then why? Well, you have
doesn't
to
a body temperature of 96 Fahrenheit, meaning 98 Fahrenheit being normal, to me means that if I don't measure directly the metabolic rate, although you could, to me it means that she's not burning much energy.
She's not burning much. Yeah, exactly. And why is she not burning much? Because she has so much in storage, right? It's sort of like if you have a refrigerator that's so full, everything's full inside, yet you have nothing to eat. Like, why is that the case, right? That's the same thing. She's sort of rationing the calories she's burning, yet she has a huge number that she's stored away and, obviously unhappy with. So, to the block here is therefore not not necessarily the calories, but the block is why can't she release those calories in so that she can use it, right? So maybe it's the insulin levels, right? And maybe it's other things like sympathetic tones and glucagons and all of these other things. Thyroid hormone is certainly one of them. Estrogen is another one of them. So all of these hormones play a role in determining how much she's going to release because it's sort of like your bank, right? So if you have a lot of money stored in the bank, but nothing in your wallet, you can't go buy a hot dog on the street, right? Because you have no cash, right? So why can't you get your money from the bank? Same thing. Why can't you get those calories out of storage, right? So that's where the block lies. It's not the total number of calories. And sometimes you have to reduce those calories to very low levels in order to change the hormonal status, right? And this is the thing. There's an interplay between the numbers of calories, the types of calories, and the hormonal changes, right? Because
Which to me,
different
can I add in carbs? Can I add carbs or like, because as being the main macronutrient that raises the insulin, I think you're kind of saying that
yeah,
um, implicitly by eating to keep the insulin low, you want to keep the carbs low. And in several cases, I've seen folks like this, they just don't understand how low they have to be on the carbohydrate. They're not eating much, and yet it's enough signal to keep the fat locked up. Is that?
exactly. And I think that's the way I like to think about it, as opposed to, well, you just need to count calories, right? Because then it's a type of calories, because certain calories are going to tell your body to keep more of it stored away. So insulin is a normal hormone, right? But it's one of its jobs is to tell your body to store energy, right? And not to release it. So if your insulin levels are very high, you're telling your body store more energy, don't release it. So therefore, if you're eating very few calories, but all refined carbohydrates, which are spiking your insulin, you're going to have a problem because that's going to be locked away. And, to me, you've mentioned perimenopause, and to me, that's the ultimate sign of that this whole calorie in, calorie out, a calorie to calorie story is so completely uh, off, because, the story we've been sold is that, hey, it's all about calories in, calories out. So if you eat less, you're going to lose weight. If you can't eat less, then it's your fault, right? If you don't have discipline or you have willpower, which is complete baloney. Because if you think about perimenopause, we know, and there's so many studies that have confirmed it, that women during that perimenopausal period tend to gain weight. It's actually one of the highest risk periods of weight gain, like, 3, 4 pounds. And so how is it that every single woman at the exact same time in her life, perimenopause, decides to lose willpower or discipline and gain weight? Like, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. And yet that's what's taught to everybody. It's calories in, calories out, right? If you're gaining weight, it's calories in, no. Obviously, it's the hormones. The hormone change that happens during perimenopause are setting you up for weight gain. Just like if you take somebody and medically castrate them for, say, prostate cancer, we know what happens. You lose muscle and gain fat. That's what happens when testosterone goes down. That happens to everybody. I don't care how much willpower or discipline you have. If you get rid of the testosterone by doing something like that for whatever treatment, and if you look in the urological data, there's tons of data on what happens after, you know, these anti-androgen drugs and so on, right? It's very consistent. You gain
Yeah.
fat, you lose muscle. Why? Because of the testosterone. It's not because of willpower. So this whole idea is like, okay, where's the lock, right? So as an internist, you have to think, where's this block, right? It's not just insulin, but it's other things, right? Cortisol can be a problem. And again, we know this. Why? Because if you give somebody prednisone, right? How many thousands of times have we prescribed prednisone for, lupus or asthma or whatever, and people gain weight? You just say, yeah, that happens. That's the side effect. Why? Did they lose willpower? Did they lose discipline? No. You gave them cortisol. You gave them prednisone, right? So
I wish by now that if someone gives prednisone, they would also give a low carb diet at the same time. Here's your prednisone diet. It would reduce the
it would help.
intake.
Yeah.
Well, so what have you learned? Kind of, I know in all your experience of using fasting as a treatment, as a kind of, how would you teach me to what parameters to use? And I finally tracked down that paper of the fellow who presumably, it's allegedly, it was in a research paper, but he went over a year without eating anything.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's weird.
that just blows my mind, and I bring that out to the medical students and residents, and they're, "But you have to have this," No, apparently not. But so how could I use fasting? And then I just got asked by someone, "I'm fasting now, how many days can I do it?" And so in the context of medical supervision, of course, I have to say that if you're, on medications and you're not under the supervision of a doctor, don't do this on your own. But, teach me how, what you've learned about the use of fasting.
Well, there's two different sort of aspects. I say I differentiate them on the length and also what's allowed during the fast, right? So in terms of length, so if you think about it, a normal fasting period is actually 12 to 14 hours. So if you eat dinner at, say, 6 p.m. or 7 p.m., you eat breakfast at like 8 a.m., 9 a.m., you're talking somewhere around 12 to 14 hours. And that's every single day without even thinking about it and not even calling it fasting, right? But
I'm just get up at night, unless you get up at night and eat, but
yeah, yeah. Well, but you're not really so fast. If you listen to your mother, right? You wouldn't be doing that. But the point is that that's sort of, people are supposed to be fasting, right? That's during the day, you're eating, you're gonna store some calories. At night, you're not eating, you're gonna use those calories, right? And if you keep them balanced, then your weight's gonna stay stable. But that's called based on, it's called break, yeah, breakfast. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
That's
It took me a long time to hear that different because we say breakfast, it's not break fast.
break
So,
fast. Yeah.
yeah, you're breaking you're fasting overnight. Well, that
Yeah, exactly.
relieves some worry about it, right?
Exactly. So you're supposed to be fasting overnight. That's where the word came from. In fact, in French, it's déjeuner, jeûner to fast, right? So it's to stop the fast, right? So it's the same idea. Wherever you go in the world, there's this idea that you're supposed to eat for a period of time. You're supposed to fast for a period of time. Then you break that fast, right? And that's normal and natural and good for you. which is always funny because when I started talking about fasting, people thought 12 hours was insane, right? Like, that's what you're supposed to do normally, guys. 8 of those are sleep, so it's not that bad. So then that doesn't make you lose a lot of weight, right? It's sort of this natural sort of balanced state, right? So if you want to push it, you can go to 16 hours, you can go to 24 hours, and there's really nothing wrong with that. And that was really what people had thought was, fasting was really highly detrimental. But really, if you look at the physiology, there's nothing detrimental about it. There's actually a huge amount of benefits. Turns out there's a lot more than I actually expected. And a lot of the data has sort of started to back that up. But then you can go longer. You can go to 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, whatever you want to, right? As long as you have body fat, you have a source of calories that you can now tap into. So if you think about how much fat you need to have, if you think about it, say you're 200 pounds and you're 25% body fat, right? This is just for easy math, but 25% body fat is not fat in any way. That's sort of like average, right? People look pretty skinny actually with 25% body fat these days. 200 pounds, 25%, you're talking about 50 pounds of body fat for a 200-pound person at sort of who's an average looking, not somebody who looks overweight. That's 50 pounds, right? Which is 375,000 calories. It's like enough for almost 100 days of fasting. So 3 months. So this average looking person could go 3 months just eating their own body fat, right? Because that's a store of calories. So if you're going to use those calories at the normal level of consumption, you have enough for 100 days. That's insane, right? You could go 100 days and people are worried when you go 16 hours, right? Of course, there's no problem with
But it's the protein, but I'm worried about getting enough protein in. That's
Yeah, I mean, there are other issues. I mean, there's clearly you don't want to be doing that because there are protein needs, right? So there's essential fatty acids that are necessary. There are essential amino acids that are necessary. Interestingly, of course, there's no essential carbohydrates that are necessary. So you could eat zero carbohydrates and still be perfectly healthy. But you do need protein, and you need certain proteins and certain amino acids, certain fatty acids. So of course, that's not, but nobody's talking about going 100 days without food, right? So, that's where when you eat, you should really be eating good food with lots of proteins, lots of fats, hopefully less carbohydrates, because that's not what you need. Your body doesn't actually need it. Your body might want it. You might want it. It might taste good, but that's a
yeah.
different story. That's the length of fast. The other differentiator is what's allowed during the fast. So there's different ways to fast. So there's the classic sort of water only fast, which is stricter than I think it needs to be if your goal is weight loss. You could certainly allow other things like coffees and teas and herbal teas and stuff with no calories. That's fine. If you add a little bit like bone broth and cream in the coffee and so on, it turns out that it really doesn't affect the fast very much because, the point of the fast is not necessarily the calories. The point is to lower the insulin so that your body is able to release those calories. So insulin's going down, you take a little bit of cream in the coffee, a little bone broth, whatever, which has a bit of protein, goes back up a little, then it just keeps going back down because the amount is very small. So that's what's allowed during the fast. And it turns out that you can actually allow much more during the fast and still maintain a lot of the benefits. So there's a lot of these data now. So there's two sort of variations of fasting that have been used commonly. There's the 5-2 fast, which is Dr. Michael Mosley's, who had written extensively about it around the same time I had. The 5-2 is sort of 5 days of eating regularly, 2 days of 500 calories. So it's not a fast at all. They're just a very low calorie day, 500 calories, which is, like a quarter of what somebody might normally eat, right? Turns out you still see a lot of the benefits. And then there's a fasting mimicking diet, which is a 5 days every month where they give you the food, but they're relatively low in calories. So around 500 to 800 calories per day for 5 days. And again, you preserve a lot of the benefits. So even if you start to allow a little bit of fast, so say if you start to go longer periods, because fasting mimicking is 5 days, but be a little less stringent, you're still going to preserve a lot of the benefits. And that's where that means gives you a lot of flexibility. You can sort of mix and match to whatever you want. You can be longer or shorter, you can be stricter or less strict. Of course, the key is still to avoid a lot of this sort of ultra processed foods and, junk foods and sugar and stuff. You're still trying to eat sort of good food. But the point is that even if it's not a complete fast, it's not like when you stop fasting, like when you eat a little bit that just cuts it, boom, your fast is done and then you go over. You can still have even those 500, 600, 700 calories and still go on. And I've tried the fasting mimicking, for example, and it's quite, it's quite doable. I mean, it was adjusted multiple times.
How about in the context of diabetes? I have people who are biohack or now CGMs are available, and they'll complain to me that when they fast, their blood sugar goes up. Well,
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. That's an interesting phenomenon. It
that
certainly
can happen.
that can definitely happen. And if you think about it, it's actually a really interesting thing because if you think about fasting and blood sugars, you expect it to go down. In many cases, it does, but sometimes it goes up. And then you'd have to say, well, where is this glucose coming from, right? Well, it can only have come from your own body. So your body basically was so full of sugar that it's now starting to release some of the sugar, even though you're not taking any sugar, right?
Oh,
So
that's
if
a
you
good way to frame it.
yeah, yeah. You don't eat for 48 hours, for example, and your blood sugar is still high. It's got to be coming from somewhere, right? Your glycogen stores are so full. You've just stored away so much of this glucose that your body's still releasing it because it cannot have come from anywhere else, right? It's the gluconeogenesis, the glycogenolysis that are starting to do it, right? And that's the whole point. Because again, if you think about what's happening, the cortisol is going up as well as your growth hormone, and both of these counter-regulatory hormones are going to actually start to push out some of the stored glucose. So if you store too much glucose, instead of the glucose going down, it's sort of starting to go up. So it can definitely happen. What it means is that you really have to do more to make sure you get rid of this sort of excess. Sort of like if you have a balloon that's sort of overfilled. The minute you release, you open it up, it starts to push out too much, right? Same thing. The glucose just starts to gush out, and it means that there's too much stored behind it, right?
Huh. Well, yeah, and since you're a fat burner, the muscle, the main part of your body isn't going to be using that glucose. And so have you given much thought to the glucose stat? I'm seeing more and more people who are worried about their glucose of 110 or 120 or 100 in milligrams per deciliter when they're not really taking any carbohydrate in. And yet it seems to me that the like a thermostat, the glucose stat doesn't always get between 80 and 100 milligrams per deciliter
Yeah.
for a long time. So even if somebody isn't eating, what are the things that could make the blood glucose be just a little bit higher and it causes all these concerns for folks? I explained because the
Okay.
insulin is low. Don't worry, the insulin's low. But what are your
Oh, absolutely. So I actually, and this is actually a really, really interesting point about measuring the insulin levels. So I know I measure the C-peptide in almost everybody. I've been doing it for years. And what it tells you is really, really interesting because what you need to know is not simply the glucose. You need to know how high the insulin is that's trying to push that glucose in, right? Because if you think about the high glucose, if it becomes too high, becomes called diabetes, right? But there's two types of diabetes. There's type 1 and there's type 2. And they're very different because type 1 is too little insulin and type 2 is too much insulin. So how are you going to know if your insulin level is high or low if you don't measure it, right? If you measure the glucose, it doesn't tell you anything about the insulin that's behind it. So if you have very little insulin, and that's why you're not pushing all the glucose into the cell, and that's why your blood glucose is a little bit higher, hey, that's not that bad, right? Because you're not talking about insulin resistance, right? Which is
right?
really the sort of underlying problem in the whole issue, right? On the other hand, if your insulin levels are way high, and that's the reason your glucose is high because you've got so much insulin and it's trying to push the glucose in, but it's not. That's insulin resistance, right? So if your glucose is high, your insulin's high. That's insulin resistance. On the other hand, your glucose is high, your insulin's low. That's not insulin resistance. That's completely different. Turns out
Well, and yet my endocrine colleagues, with their infinite wisdom, explain that your pancreas is burnt out, and even with a glucose that's a little elevated, they're giving insulin to try to get it back down, and I try to explain it's not the same thing as type 2, and so how are you kind of just
Yeah,
reassuring?
that's completely, yeah, that's, to me, that's not a very good argument at all
Well, but
because
then the latest is to measure the, antibodies, right? You have
the
lot
bad
you have
antibodies.
antibodies. I don't know. I think if people could have a choice, just don't eat the carbs, power through the glucose being a little elevated with the insulin low, over time I had one person who, it took a couple years actually for the glucose to finally get into that under 100 milligram per deciliter range, and, it was her choice not to wanna go back to insulin, which made her gain weight,
Yeah.
but, I wonder so what best I can tell, there are several areas, and maybe every cell sends out a signal that I need sugar or need energy, but the glucose status seems to me is not perfectly in sync, or for those who don't eat carbs, it's not quite the same as for those who do eat carbs. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think we're talking about the same sort of thing. I think, the whole idea that, the pancreas burning out is sort of like, it's strange for them to say that because if you look at all the classic studies and what we're see episodes there. Yeah, the C side, but it should still be high, right? Even as it starts to come down in type 2 diabetes. So it goes from sort of normal C-peptide to sky high C-peptide to still high, but a little bit lower than a peak, right? So when they're talking about burning out pancreas, you're talking about still C-peptide levels that are very, very high, right? Not low, not lower than normal, right? So that's a completely different argument. Just because it's not as high as it used to be doesn't mean that it's lower than normal, right? It's just not as high as it used to be. But the whole idea is that you have to look at both the C-peptide, which is a reflection, and it is still quite variable, I have to say. The C-peptide is less variable than the insulin, but still very variable. So I actually measure it all the time. And the thing is that once you start to measure it, you start to realize that there's actually a whole lot of people who have LADA, which is LADA, which is latent autoimmune disease in adults. And what happens is I have all these people who are like, they're skinny, they're like 80 years old, skinny. They eat the same thing for the whole life, and their A1Cs are like a little high, right? 6.1. And what you find over time is that their C-peptides are actually, they start out sort of low normal or normal, and then they start to drift down. So you start to realize that these people are actually LADA. And it turns out there's a huge number of these people. What happened, of course, is that in adults, as soon as you get diabetes, you get thrown into type 2 diabetes because 95% or so, that's what they say, of people are type 2 diabetes. But until you measure the C-peptide, you actually cannot know if their insulin levels are high or low, which is the main differentiating point. Because I measure it, I know that it actually starts off in a lot of people as normal, and then over 10 years, because I've been following them for 10 plus years, then their insulin levels start to fall into the low range, not normal, like lower than normal. So their pancreas is not burning out because it was never going over and above in the first place. It probably was its autoimmune thing, this very slow autoimmune thing, which is the LADA. So I actually think it's closer to like 20% of the adult population, especially those ones who are atypical, right? So if you're, got a big fatty liver, you're overweight, you have a big abdomen, right? Abdominal obesity and hypertension and all the classic manifestations, you likely have type 2 diabetes. If you're relatively slender, you're pretty active and stuff, and you're still getting your sugars a little high, then you need to know, are you actually type 2? Because I actually find that in my clinical practice, a huge number, like 30-40% of these atypical people are not actually type 2 diabetes. Which doesn't mean you can't use a low carbohydrate diet, right? So I still use a low carbohydrate diet with them because if they're not producing a lot of insulin, then if they don't need so much insulin because their diet means, like a ketogenic diet, means that they don't need to produce a lot of insulin, hey, that works, right? It keeps them, good for a couple of years. But I always warn them, this is not a dietary problem. This is an autoimmune problem. So therefore, don't expect the diet to fix your problem because later on, we're still going to have to treat it with something. But then there's a difference because these people are slender. If you're going to give them insulin, it's okay because their insulin levels are low. So now giving them insulin is fine. as opposed to type 2 where your insulin levels are high and you're trying to give him insulin. That makes no sense, right? It's like giving a hyperthyroid patient thyroid medication. It doesn't make sense. You give a hypothyroid patient thyroid medication. Same thing. If your insulin level's high, bring it down. If your insulin level's low, bring it up, right? And that's where it's really important. I've talked to a number of doctors in the US and they actually can't get it. They're always frustrated because I can't get it. The insurance won't cover it, so my patients won't pay for it. And I'm like, I'm lucky because I practice in Canada. I actually just write it down and they measure it for me, right? And so I've been measuring it practically in all my patients for at least 5 to sometimes 10 years.
Well, and you can get it. Someone may have to pay for it, but
Yeah, you have
I
to
mean,
pay for it.
so many people think, oh, if it's not covered by insurance, anyway. So I want to get to spend plenty of time on your new book, The Hunger Code. Congratulations again.
Thank you.
I know it's kind of like having a baby, another child. And what was the idea of the Hunger Code, and what did you learn from doing it? I've learned a lot from.
Yeah, thanks. So the hunger code is really trying to get to so it's sort of a follow-up to the obesity code. So the obesity code was really trying to get people away from this idea that's all calories in, calories out, and trying to get them to think about, the hormones, the insulin, the sort of set body set weight or the body fat thermostat. And the whole idea is that that's not the only reason the hormones and stuff that we eat. We eat because we're hungry, right? And the second part of that is, why are you hungry, right? So on the one hand, it could be from the hormones, it could be from the homeostasis, but it turns out there's actually a huge amount of literature now pointing to other things that cause hunger. So not just the physical hunger. This is called the homeostatic hunger. So we're talking about homeostatic balance, right? So that's the hormones. That's the sort of physical hunger. You feel hungry, your stomach's growling, you want food, right? But that's not the only reason we eat. In fact, in many cases, it's the minority of cases that's why we eat, right? There's a huge amount of eating behavior that's driven by the other two types. One is the sort of emotional hunger, which is called hedonic hunger. And the third is the sort of social hunger, which is called conditioned hunger. So hedonic hunger, which is the sort of emotional hunger, is basically eating because it makes you feel better, right? So if you are depressed, we know that eating releases reward pathways. Eating is pleasurable. People like it, obviously, right? That's not like for debate. But if you're eating, for example, because you're bored and you need a little pick-me-up, or you're depressed and you need a little pick-me-up, right? That's a completely different reason that you're eating than the homeostatic hunger, in which case you need to now deal with that. And sometimes, and the biggest culprits here are going to be the ultra processed foods, because they have a way to sort of dial up the hedonic hunger to very high levels, not by accident. Like, there are focus groups that, try and do, make sure that you eat more. And, there's these artificial flavors and colors and artificial sweeteners and all this other stuff, texturizers, emulsifiers that make this, it's not like left to chance, right? This sort of hedonic hunger, this pleasure of eating. But it can also tip into food addiction, which there's also a huge amount of data now that says that a lot of problematic eating behavior is driven by food addiction. And if you don't understand addiction, you won't treat it properly. Because the more you know about it, the better you are. If you're addicted, then you need to treat it completely differently, because you can't say, for example, everything in moderation, right? That's a stupid thing to say to an addict, right? If you're has an alcohol, just have one drink to an alcoholic, right? You're an alcoholic, I get it, but hey, everything in moderation, right? No, you'd be like the worst friend ever, right? Or like, hey, I know you're addicted to cocaine and you're trying to quit, but they take a little sniff, right? It's everything in moderation. No, obviously not. And people say things like, oh, but you can't not eat food. I'm like, I'm not telling you not to eat food. I'm telling you not to eat ultra processed food, the food that you're addicted to, right? And people tell you, I'm addicted to bread. I'm addicted to carbs. I'm addicted to sugar. I'm addicted to sweets, right? So if you're addicted to, you know, carbs, don't eat carbs. Did I say don't eat eggs? No. You're right. If you're addicted to alcohol, did I tell you not to drink water? No. Like, you can drink water. Like, that's a stupid thing to say, but people say it in food addiction all the time. The interesting thing, of course, now is that in the last 5 to 10 years, there's actually been a huge amount of data being generated research on both ultra-processed foods and food addictions. There's this Yale food addict score, which has allowed people to study it on a more scientific basis, right? And that's where people are starting to say, hey, this is a real issue, right? Because if the problem is ultra-processed foods, you have to focus on the processing, not on the calories, for example, right? It's the way they're processed that makes the difference, not the calories that are contained within it, right? If this is a driving, for example, your addiction, the ultra processed carbohydrates, which, obviously, if people say I'm addicted to, bread and I'm addicted to rice and this and stuff, right? They don't say I'm addicted to cauliflower, right? Like who says that? Or I'm addicted to beef liver. No, I've never heard that in my whole life, right? So that's the whole point. So if it's hedonic hunger that's driving your eating, then you have to focus on the hedonic hunger. And the third thing is the social hunger, which is called conditioned hunger. And this gets into the idea of habits and stuff, right? So you compare
Okay.
two things together, and that's called conditioning. That's a term from behavioral psychology. So if you always eat when you go watch a football game, then when you watch a football game, you're going to want to eat, right? So the hunger is being driven not by, physical hunger because you're not actually hungry. It's not driven by emotions because you're just going to scan. It's driven by the fact that you always eat, right? So that's conditioning, right? So the problem is that we've conditioned food into everything we do throughout the day, right? So you get up, you have to eat. You have a coffee, you have to eat. It's lunchtime, you have to eat. It's after school, you have to eat. It's you're in front of the TV, you have to eat. Going to see a movie, you have to eat. You're meeting friends, you have to eat, right? You get in the car for a road trip, you have to eat, right? So every single thing is like bing, 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 bing. Basically, that's the food noise people talk about because you're creating this hunger everywhere you go. And it doesn't happen in other countries in the world, right? Because they don't have that conditioning, right? So certain countries, you just can't eat in the same places. It's not socially acceptable. So therefore, they never condition themselves to eat while walking on the street, for example. So therefore, that's not one of the things that they have to worry about, right? But it's not a willpower problem. It's a problem with the social issues. And we see this. So there's two issues here, which is one is social, which is conditioning. The second is social modeling, which is that the people around you sort of define what is acceptable and not acceptable. And that makes a huge difference because if you go to Japan, for example, and the portions are much smaller, you're just going to eat less because that's the socially acceptable thing to do. Then you get to the United States and say Florida or Texas where the portions are huge. Again, the socially acceptable thing is to eat it all because you don't want to leave stuff on the plate and you don't want to take it in a doggy bag and all this sort of stuff, right? So you eat what's there, but it's like double the amount that you would have been served in a restaurant in Japan, for example. So again, the social environment and the physical environment is actually what's causing the problems and the real issues, right? So in a lot of cases, if you only think about sort of the diet, you're sort of only focusing in on a small portion of the problem. You have to look at the emotional side and you have to look at the social side. And then when you get the whole picture, then you can say, okay, well, now I can figure out what the best strategy is because each of those types of hunger are going to require different things. Because, if your problem is, say, ultra processed foods, then cutting calories is not necessarily the problem. You're dealing with the wrong problem. Same with everything, right? If you're not getting enough sleep and that's what's driving your eating, then eating fewer calories is not a good strategy, right? And this is the thing that we were taught, right? Just eat fewer calories is the solution to every single problem. So if your problem is that you're working night shifts all the time, the answer is either get better sleep or figure out how you're going to deal with your night shift, right? Or if your problem is emotional eating, then eat fewer calories is not a strategy. If your problem is sort of, food addiction, then eat fewer calories is not the solution, right? It's about defining the problem better so that you can use the more appropriate tools for it, right? Not use the same tool for every single problem.
Although keto, carnivore, low carb, fasting cuts across a whole lot of
That's
the
why they're so
one
effective.
fell swoop.
That's exactly right. And that was why I said, of the golden rules, I have these golden rules in the book where one is cut ultra processed foods, the other is fasting, and the third is about the social redesign your physical and social environment, right? But keto, from a dietary standpoint, not the emotional side of things, right? But from a dietary standpoint, the keto, the fasting, the carnivore cuts across all these different types of hunger because one, you're driving down your insulin, but you're driving up like, peptide YY, cholecystokinin, GLP-1, GIP, right? So massively beneficial from a homeostatic perspective. From a hedonic perspective, it's not one of these problematic things. It doesn't lead to food addictions, and it's not one of these things that, causes the sort of hedonic hunger. And third, because it's not as convenient as, say, opening a bag of chips or something, you don't condition it, right? Because it's not like you go to, sit in front of the TV, you can just grab a cookie or grab a bag of chips, right? The ultra processed foods are so easy. You're not going to go fry yourself a little piece of salmon, right? That's ridiculous. Like by the time you get it, half your show is over, right? So it cuts across all the different types of hunger. From a dietary standpoint, it's actually way, way better. But understanding it is important because then you can say, okay, well, if I just want to do this, well, that's what I'm going to do, and it's going to take care of these other problems for me.
Well, again, thank you for the hunger code and the practical advice. I've always enjoyed learning from you, and my patients, you know, watch you all the time, listen, and hopefully read all the time. I wonder, briefly, like one or two sentences, what do you think of the new U.S. dietary guideline for Americans?
No, I really, I think they're great, actually. I think
Yeah,
that one of
I know.
the yeah, way better than I even had hopes for. It's like because, from two standpoints. One, when they flipped the pyramid sort of upside down, what they really did was they basically signaled that, yes, it was wrong. Those previous ones were wrong. They're almost exactly wrong, actually, right? That's what it means when you flip it upside down, right? So, yeah, it was great. So the point is that, and if you look at the sort of focus on getting rid of ultra processed foods, that's exactly what the book says too, right? Get rid of the ultra processed foods. That's going to get you most of the way there, right? I mean, yes, we can quibble about carbs and this and that, but getting rid of ultra processed foods is
Yeah.
really just one of the massive things that we need to do. And it was such a, to me, it was such a breath of fresh air. Like obviously it's people are there was a lot of people who are very unhappy about it. I mean, a lot of people on, like me and you who are actually ecstatic. I was like, whoa, this is amazing, right? This is going to do a lot of good, in my opinion, right? So I thought it was just tremendous because now we're getting away from sort of this whole, oh, let's count calories and eat less fat sort of thing. And there's the fat thing is still in there. There's little things that, you can quibble about, but overall, the general thing, like the
So,
saturated fat thing was still there, right? But,
question two, what do you think of GLP-1s and GLP-1, GIP, the new shots, weight loss shots?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And again, to me, it makes perfect sense why these things work, right? Because GLP-1 is one of the systems I talked about in the hunger code. And what you're basically doing, of course, is using the GLP-1 system, which is part of the satiety hormones, part of that homeostatic system, and just basically squelching all your hunger. So if you have emotional issues, right? If you have hedonic hunger and you're basically using the GLP-1 system. And remember that you're not getting normal levels of GLP-1, right? These are big, big doses of GLP-1, right? They're pharmacologic doses, right? So you can get physiologic doses of GLP-1 with DPP-4 medications, right? Januvia and some of these Tridentas and stuff, right? So that doesn't cause barely any weight loss because it doesn't do much. When you get these massive doses of GLP-1, then you can use that to squelch all your other types of hunger, whether it's conditioned hunger. And so people say, well, I used to want to eat when I'm watching TV, but now I no longer do. Yeah, because you're using the GLP-1 system to squelch it. And that's fine. Like there's going to be a role for that. So I'm not against them. The problem is that if you wind up going off of ththen, and you haven't learned anything about hedonic hunger and conditioned hunger and why you're eating and the emotional side and all that, what happens? Well, all that weight just comes right back. You haven't gotten anything. You've gotten temporary weight loss from the GLP-1s. And of course, as a drug, there are side effects. People like to pretend there's no side effects, but there's always side effects, right? And people, I had one person say to me, good Lord, is like, so there's this concern about eye problems, blindness. It's about 1 in 10,000, right? And I actually had one patient who actually came to me and said, they started losing vision in one eye, and their ophthalmologist said it was because of the GLP-1. So, it happens. It's rare. It's rare, but it doesn't happen. Somebody says, oh, but the benefits are going to be so much better. It's like, okay, but how can you just, yeah, sure, but what about, like, let's not forget about side effects here, because if you're taking it because you're 400 pounds and you've got your A1C is 10.5%, that's one thing. If you're taking it to lose a couple of pounds to look good for the red carpet, that's a totally different thing. You have almost no medical benefit whatsoever, and you have the same risk, right? So the risk benefit ratio is completely different, right? So just because yes, they will help the person on the far end of the scale where they're like, okay, you're gonna get a heart attack imminently, it doesn't mean that everybody should be using it the way that's happened, because the problem is that basically you don't even need a prescription. You can walk into the medical spa and get a prescription. You have these 5-minute online interviews. Remember Sequence and all those shady sort of pill mills that were being run that Weight Watchers bought and got them, went bankrupted them. So the whole idea is that you can't just let people do it themselves, because there's a risk to these drugs. I mean, that's why you should be prescribed, because there's a risk to it. So the whole thing is that, yes, they have their place, but do people stay on it, right? And that's the real question. And they don't. That's the whole problem, right? So
Well, I try to remind people, even though every other doctor now uses GLP-1s and typically doesn't say what to eat, which is a problem, um, that there are other options. I mean, so before shots, there were pills, and before pills, there were diets. And so if I have a moment to just explain the whole, array, the menu of options, most people will change the food and if it clicks, but often they're not given that choice by doctors today. But okay,
no.
final thing, you're French. I actually déjeuner. The so petit déjeuner is the breakfast,
Breakfast, yeah.
and you said fasting. Is that really what déjeuner?
Jeûner.
So
I think I looked that up one time. The
that's
French
it, and then but jeune fille, jeune means young.
jeûne, yeah, but I think the verb, let me see.
Yeah,
I'll
it
look
is.
it up.
Well, but so I found in my I learned some French and, growing up, but I haven't used it in a long time, but talking to a, friend who's Parisian, I mentioned, "What about, féculents?" These foods, and I was reading the Montignac diet book in French, and there's an area that says it's féculent. It basically, she said, "Yeah, those are starches, those are pulses," and I said, "No, féculent from the Greek means stool." Feces. It means feces. So trying to bring it together, the French people knew that if you ate starches, you'd get more feces. They called them féculents. Although in her mind, she said, "No, that's not what it means." And I said, "Well, but no, I'm going back." So if maybe déjeuner and jeûne, being young, those who fasted are young or maintain youth. It's
Maybe.
the garden of it's the fountain of youth.
Yeah, it could be, it could be.
That's
That's
it.
interesting. I
Can
never
you
thought about it like that.
write an essay for me, please? No. Yeah, I'd actually now maybe I have the ability to write one on the déjeuner. Of course, break fast
Break,
was,
yeah.
it just didn't breakfast. It's not breaking a fast. Well, it is the 12-hour,
It
well,
is.
but unless you eat in the middle of the night. And anyway,
Yeah,
thank you for letting me
interesting.
try to bring a multilingual. So in Toronto, you're not bilingue, and you don't have to be, right? That's
No, that's mostly Montreal and Quebec. They use the French, but we learn it in school and stuff. But it's just an interesting sort of tidbit because the interesting thing about what you're saying, the fountain of youth, is that there actually is some data on reducing biological age with some of these fasting regimens. And it makes sense. Like the whole thing makes sense, right? So it's like there's so much more to unpack here, but it's like, it's like people are more interested in, like you look at how people interested were in diets and stuff and fasting, and then you look at the interest in like the GLP-1s, right? And it's like, oh, right. It's like that's all people want to know about, right? It's like, okay, well, good luck to you if you do it, right? But the data is actually very bad on GLP-1s, right? In terms of staying on it, right? So like 50 to 70% of people are off within a year, right? So it's like if you can't stay on it, you don't get any benefits.
Yeah, well, there'll be, these are first generation, second generation, they're going to be third generation, fourth generation shots. But I you think there's a role for them and think they're going to help a lot of people.
There's a role because there's always people who are quite ill, right? But the problem is that when you start to, and here's my take on why people quit these things, is that eating is actually one of life's great pleasures, right? So everybody knows that, right? So that's how you celebrate. Every culture in history has celebrated. Front desk, Yvonne, to the front desk. Every culture in history has always celebrated with food, right? So, oh, Thanksgiving, have a big feast. Christmas, have a big feast. Now, think about being on a GLP-1 where you're basically squelching your hunger and you're nauseated.
Yeah.
So you go to Thanksgiving dinner, everybody's having a good time.
Who doesn't taste right? Yeah.
Blah, right?
Yeah.
Then you go to Christmas and it's like everybody's having a great time. Blah, right? Then you have your birthday and everybody's having a good time. And you're blah, right? Everything is beige. The whole world is beige, right? That's what people say. And it's like, okay, so you go through 6 months like that. After a year, you're like, I am gonna shoot myself because I just don't enjoy any of this, right? Like, yes, sure, you enjoy the company, but you're not having a good time the way you used to have a good time. Like, the way you would be like, oh, I'm gonna get together with my pals and we're gonna have a big ol', whatever it is, right? We're gonna have a huge steak dinner because we had a promotion, right? Now you're like, okay, good for you, promotion. This steak is just making me nauseated at this point, right? So it's like
Yeah.
it's a real problem, and people don't want to live like that. Like honestly, they vote with their feet, right? So it's the reality. The reality is that they don't want to stay on it for the benefits, right? If you're very sick, of course you'll do it, but if you're not very sick, then it's like no, and then you're gonna gain the weight back because once you go off, we know what happens.
So if only the um, cleaning up the ultra processed foods happened before the GLP-1s, so that now that people have been off the ultra processed food, they can off ramp onto good real food. That would be the ideal world where we clean up all the crap or the junk at the
Yeah,
ultra processed food. Wait, it's all the same thing, and then people can off ramp to real food.
that's right.
Dr. Fung, Jason, always a pleasure. Check out the Hunger Code and keep up the great work.
Thanks so much. It's great talking to you, Aaron.
If you enjoyed this video, consider joining our YouTube membership for early access and exclusive live Q&As with me. Just click the join button below or support us with a PayPal in the description.